Imagine a life marked by beauty, success, and a promising future, only to have it shattered in a whirlwind of power, corruption, and danger. This is not fiction. This is the true story of Imane Fadil, a Moroccan model who, while chasing dreams of stardom, found herself tangled in the shadows of one of the most controversial political figures of our time, Silvio Berlusconi. What started as a dazzling life in the spotlight quickly turned into a chilling and mysterious disappearance. A life silenced just as it was about to reveal the darkest secrets of the powerful. What really happened to Imane Fadil, and why did her name become a symbol of fear and suspicion? Let's unravel a case where the line between power and danger blurs in ways you could never imagine. Imane Fadil's life began like many others, full of ambition and promise. Born in Morocco, she moved to Italy to build a career in the glamorous world of fashion. But her trajectory would soon collide with Italy's political elite, and her role in the public eye would take a much darker turn. At the heart of this story is her connection to Silvio Berlusconi, the former Italian prime minister whose Bunga Bunga parties became notorious in the media. These exclusive, lavish gatherings were filled with celebrities, models, and some of the most influential people in Italy. But behind the glamour and wealth, there were whispers of corruption, exploitation, and abuse of power. Imane, who was once part of this world, chose to speak out, to reveal the ugly truths behind the glitzy facade. Little did she know that decision would place her in a perilous spotlight. Her testimony in Berlusconi's legal troubles was not just another headline, it was a bombshell. Imane Fadil became a crucial witness in the high profile trials, and she wasn't just testifying about the parties. She was ready to expose the secret underworld that many thought untouchable. But before she could fully reveal what she knew, Imane disappeared under suspicious circumstances. And what followed would shock Italy, casting shadows on the powerful and igniting international intrigue. This is not just a tale of a woman lost to a cruel fate. This is a story of political intrigue, deception, and the question that still haunts investigators today: what really happened to Imane Fadil? Imane Fadil's story begins far from the glittering world of Italian politics and high society. Born in Morocco, she was raised in a modest but proud family. Her upbringing was rooted in strong family values, a deep connection to her Moroccan heritage, and a fierce sense of independence. From an early age, Imane stood out for her beauty and ambition, but it was her intelligence and determination that set her apart. She was not content to live an ordinary life. She dreamed of something bigger, a world where she could be seen and heard. As a young woman, Imane moved to Italy, drawn by the allure of the European fashion industry. She believed that modeling would be her gateway to success, and Italy, with its rich fashion history, seemed like the perfect place to begin. Her journey was not easy. She faced the challenges of being an immigrant in a foreign land, navigating a competitive industry, and struggling to make a name for herself in a world where beauty often comes with a price. Despite these hurdles, Imane's aspirations never wavered. She saw modeling as more than just a career. It was her ticket to independence, a way to support her family back in Morocco and to build a life of her own making. She was driven by a need to prove herself, not just to her peers, but to a world that often underestimated her. In Italy, she began to make connections, slowly gaining access to the circles of wealth and power that she had once only seen from afar. Her striking beauty and poised demeanor opened doors, but her real motivation was always much deeper than the superficial world she found herself in. Imane wanted to rise above the limitations placed on her as a woman, as an immigrant, and as someone who came from a humble background. But as she climbed the social ladder, Emaine would soon find that the world she was stepping into was far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The glittering parties, the powerful men, the promises of success all came with a dark undercurrent. And though she was there for a career in fashion, her journey would soon take her into a world of political scandal and intrigue where the stakes were much higher than she ever bargained for. Her early life, her dreams, her journey, all of these would set the stage for a much more sinister chapter of her story. A chapter where her ambition, beauty, and intelligence would become both her strength and her vulnerability. Imane Fadil was no stranger to the challenges of life, but nothing could have prepared her for the whirlwind of power, manipulation, and danger she was about to face. The term Bunga Bunga became synonymous with scandal and excess during Silvio Berlusconi's tumultuous time in the public eye. These notorious parties were held at Berlusconi's lavish residences, where the boundaries between politics, entertainment, and illicit activities blurred. What started as whispers of extravagant gatherings quickly turned into a full blown media frenzy as more details emerged about what really went on behind closed doors. These events, far from simple social gatherings, were characterized by their wild nature, a toxic mix of wealth, power, and exploitation. Imane Fadel, a young model with dreams of success, found herself at the center of these infamous gatherings. Like many others, she had been invited to these so called parties, unaware of the dark undercurrent that lurked beneath the glamorous surface. The Bunga Bunga parties weren't just lavish affairs filled with celebrities and politicians, they became a breeding ground for exploitation, where young women were lured into a web of manipulation by powerful men. Imane's involvement would go on to play a pivotal role in revealing the truth behind these gatherings. The parties themselves were a spectacle of excess. Young women, often models or aspiring actresses like Imane, were invited under the guise of opportunity and networking. But once inside, the atmosphere shifted into something far more disturbing. Reports from various attendees described the parties as debauched affairs, where Berlusconi and his powerful friends indulged in behavior that crossed ethical and legal lines. The presence of underage girls, the exchange of money, and the expectation of certain favors all painted a picture of a deeply corrupt and morally bankrupt environment. Imane Fadil became one of the key witnesses to this unsettling reality. When she decided to come forward and testify, it was a decision that would change the course of her life. Her testimony was not just about exposing the parties themselves, but about unveiling the darker truths behind the powerful men who orchestrated them. She revealed details that shook the foundations of Berlusconi's carefully constructed image, speaking out about the pressure placed on women to participate in these gatherings, the systemic exploitation, and the fear that surrounded those who knew too much. Her statements were shocking, but they also placed her in a precarious position. By daring to lift the veil on what really happened at these parties, Imane became a target. She knew that revealing the secrets of someone as powerful as Berlusconi came with great risk. But even in the face of potential danger, she persisted, determined to tell the truth. Imane's role as a key witness in the trials against Berlusconi wasn't just about her own experiences. She was speaking for all the women who had been caught in the web of these parties, many of whom were too afraid to come forward. Her courage in standing up against a man as powerful as Berlusconi made her testimony one of the most crucial elements in the legal case. The Bunga Bunga parties represented more than just a political scandal. They symbolized the corrupt intersection of power, wealth, and exploitation. Imane Fadil's involvement in these parties and her subsequent decision to testify pulled the curtain back on a world that many preferred to keep hidden. But this exposure came at a steep cost. Her courage in the courtroom put her in the crosshairs of those who had much to lose from the truth being revealed. And soon the consequences of her bravery would manifest in ways no one could have anticipated. The courtroom was a battlefield, and Imane Fadil was the unexpected weapon no one saw coming. At first glance, she was just another beautiful face in the Italian social scene, a model with dreams navigating the glamorous, high stakes world of fashion and elite parties. But the moment she stepped forward to testify against Silvio Berlusconi, she became something much more, a beacon of truth, ready to dismantle a carefully curated empire built on secrets, lies, and exploitation. Silvio Berlusconi's legal battles were nothing new. By the time Imane Fadil took the stand, he had already been at the center of countless scandals involving corruption, tax evasion, and sordid allegations of misconduct. Yet, no case seemed to threaten his grip on power quite like the Rubbagate scandal, which accused him of paying for sex with an underage girl, Ruby Rubakiwari. But this was more than just a case about one girl. It was a doorway to uncovering the sickening reality of his private world, one where the lines between privilege and perversion disappeared. Imane Fadil's testimony changed everything. She was no passive witness. The moment she opened her mouth, the courtroom and the country sat up and listened. Fadil described in painstaking detail the so-called Bunga Bunga parties, and she wasn't just another attendee, she was an insider, someone who had seen firsthand how the young women were treated as mere playthings for powerful men. Her words carried the weight of someone who knew she was revealing the darkest aspects of Italy's elite society, and there was no turning back. She told the court how she was invited to what she believed were glamorous social events, opportunities to mingle with influential figures who could potentially help her career. But as the night wore on, the glitz and glamour wore off, replaced by something far more sinister. She recounted how the parties were less about celebration and more about exploitation. Young women, some barely adults, were presented to Berlusconi and his wealthy guests, encouraged to entertain them, dance provocatively, and offer more than just companionship. Money and gifts flowed freely, but the expectation was clear: participation came with a price. Fadil spoke of how some women were coerced into sexual acts, with promises of career advancement hanging over their heads like a noose. She painted a picture of women being lured into a web of manipulation, their vulnerabilities exploited by men who saw themselves as untouchable. Berlusconi, at the center of it all, remained calm and confident in court, but Fadil's testimony was cracking the foundation beneath him. Her revelations went beyond just salacious details. They exposed a deep corruption within Italy's power structures. Berlusconi's legal team did everything they could to discredit her, but Fadil was fearless, unwavering in her account. She didn't just speak for herself, she spoke for all the women trapped in this system of exploitation, too afraid or powerless to come forward. Every word she said was a challenge to the old guard, the untouchable elite who had ruled Italy with impunity for decades. The effect of her testimony rippled far beyond the courtroom. Across Italy, there was a palpable shift in how the public viewed Berlusconi. For years, his scandals had been dismissed as mere tabloid fodder, his charisma shielding him from real accountability. But Fadil's words forced the country to confront an uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just a man having fun at parties. This was a man abusing his power, manipulating vulnerable women for his own pleasure, while using his wealth to cover it up. Fadil's bravery in coming forward didn't just place Berlusconi under scrutiny, it shone a light on the systemic corruption that had allowed him to remain in power for so long. For years, Italy had turned a blind eye to the moral decay in its leadership, but now the veil was being lifted, and the country could no longer ignore the truth. Imane Fadil was the key witness in a case that had the potential to bring down one of Italy's most powerful men. Her testimony was clear, detailed, and damning. But with each revelation, the danger to her life became more real. She had seen too much, and she was exposing it all. And in the dark corners of power, that kind of courage often comes with a fatal cost. The moment Imane Fadil stepped into the courtroom, the media frenzy ignited like wildfire. What was once a quiet legal proceeding involving powerful figures had now exploded into a full-blown spectacle, and Imane was at the center of it all. The headlines screamed her name not just as a model, but as the courageous whistleblower who dared to pull back the curtain on one of Italy's most controversial political figures, Silvio Berlusconi. Before her testimony, Imane Fadil was known to the public as a Moroccan model, someone who appeared at high society events, mingling with Italy's elite. But now, the spotlight was on her for a different reason altogether. Every newspaper, TV station, and tabloid began running her story, dissecting every detail of her life, her career, and her role in the Bunga Bunga scandal. She had gone from an outsider in the world of Italian politics to a central figure in one of the country's biggest political scandals. The media painted her as both a hero and a victim, someone who had been caught in the crossfire of power and corruption, but who chose to speak out against it. Imane's face was splashed across magazine covers, television screens, and online news platforms as the world eagerly awaited every detail of her testimony. With every new revelation, the tension around her story grew, and so did the pressure on Imane herself. For the press, Imane represented a sensational story, a model entangled in a political scandal, the insider who had witnessed the dark secrets of Italy's most powerful man. But behind the glamour and intrigue, there was a darker truth. Imane was paying a steep price for her bravery. As the media attention grew, so too did the risks she faced. Journalists followed her every move, swarming outside the courthouse, waiting for sound bites and comments. Paparazzi hounded her in the streets, turning her life into a spectacle for the public's consumption. Every detail of her personal life was dragged into the open, with the media prying into her relationships, her past, and her motives. They weren't just telling her story, they were feeding a narrative that made her an international symbol of whistleblowing, placing an enormous burden on her shoulders. Imane was now more than just a witness. She became a whistleblower, a figure who embodied the dangers of speaking truth to power. Her every word in court was scrutinized, every gesture analyzed. But with this newfound public attention came tremendous pressure. The media coverage painted a target on her back, exposing her to risks far beyond the courtroom. Powerful figures with much to lose were now watching her every move, and the constant media attention only amplified the stakes. The intense spotlight also changed the way people around her treated her. Friends, family, and colleagues were thrust into the limelight as well, often unwillingly. Imane herself had to navigate a new reality where her safety was no longer guaranteed. In interviews, she had expressed fear of being followed, of her phone being tapped, of the looming threat that something could happen to her for revealing too much. But despite the overwhelming pressure, Imane did not waver. The media's relentless coverage may have turned her life upside down, but it also gave her a platform to be heard. Her testimony became more than just words spoken in court. It became a story of resilience, of a woman who refused to be silenced in the face of immense power. Each time she appeared in public, there was a sense of defiance in her presence, a refusal to back down despite the growing threats to her safety. Yet, as the headlines grew bolder and the scandal deepened, the risks she faced became all the more real. Imane had entered a game where the stakes were life and death, and the media attention, while giving her a voice, also amplified the dangers lurking in the shadows. Her public transformation from model to whistleblower made her a beacon of truth, but also placed her in the crosshairs of powerful enemies. The relentless coverage became a double edged sword. On one hand, it brought her bravery into the spotlight, forcing the world to acknowledge the corruption and exploitation she had exposed. On the other, it made her vulnerability painfully obvious. The pressure on Imane was mounting, and the media, whether knowingly or not, had played a role in intensifying the risks she would face in the weeks to come.
As the story of the Bunga Bunga scandal continued to unravel, the world watched, transfixed. But for Imane Fadil, this was no longer just a courtroom battle or a political scandal. It was a fight for her very survival, and every headline, every article, only served as a reminder of the storm she had unleashed and the dangers that awaited her just around the corner.
As the trial against Silvio Berlusconi progressed, Imane Fadil's fears for her safety began to intensify, slowly turning into a terrifying reality that she could no longer ignore. The walls were closing in, and she knew too much, too many secrets, too many details about powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their carefully crafted facades. The courtroom may have been a stage for justice, but outside its walls, a darker game was unfolding, one where the stakes were no longer about reputation, but life and death. In multiple interviews, both before and during the trial, Fadl made it clear that she was living in constant fear. Her words were not the anxious musings of someone caught in a media frenzy, they were the careful, deliberate statements of a woman who knew her life was in danger. In one particularly chilling interview, Fadl openly expressed her growing paranoia. I know they are following me. They watch me. I can feel it. I don't know who they are, but I know they're there. These were not empty claims. Fadl felt the invisible eyes on her wherever she went. Her concerns weren't just vague feelings. She believed she was being monitored, watched closely by those who had the means and the motive to keep her quiet. In another interview, she voiced her fears more directly. I am afraid. I have seen what happens to people who speak out. I feel like I am next. These words echoed her understanding of the dangerous path she had chosen. By stepping into the spotlight as a whistleblower, she had become a threat to men who had built their power on silencing others. Fadl's growing fear was not an isolated feeling. The escalating tension surrounding the trial played a significant role in amplifying her dread. Berlusconi's legal team was fiercely defending him, and as the trial went on, the pressure on Imane increased tenfold. Her testimony was pivotal, and she knew that the stakes were high for all parties involved. But the trial was more than just a legal battle. It was a clash of power, a battle of influence, and Imane was caught in the crossfire. As more details about the scandal came to light, the courtroom became a battleground, and Fadil found herself at the center of a storm that threatened to consume her. There were moments when she expressed specific concerns about her safety to close friends, fearing that her phone was being tapped and that her movements were being tracked. Some reports even suggested that Fadil had gone as far as changing her daily routines, taking alternate routes to avoid being followed, and staying in different locations to protect herself. I don't feel safe, she had told a confidant shortly before her death, a statement that now haunts the investigation. What made these fears so real was the growing number of threats she received, both subtle and direct. Fadil believed that people in Berlusconi's circle were watching her, not just to intimidate her, but to gather information, anything that could be used to discredit her or worse, harm her. The sense of surveillance became suffocating, and with each passing day, her dread grew. She had stepped into a dangerous game, one where the powerful had far more resources and far fewer scruples. In the weeks leading up to her mysterious death, her behavior became increasingly cautious. She limited her public appearances, and when she did go out, she was often seen looking over her shoulder as though expecting something or someone to be waiting for her. The paranoia was not without merit. In a trial of this magnitude, where political and personal reputations were at risk, people had much to lose, and Emaine was keenly aware of the fact that her testimony had shifted the tide against Berlusconi in a way that couldn't be ignored. There was a moment just before the trial reached its most intense phase when Emaine reportedly confided in a friend, saying, I feel like something bad is going to happen to me. I don't know when or how, but I can feel it coming. This premonition would, tragically, prove to be accurate. Emaine Fadl was walking a dangerous line, and her fears were not just the result of media pressure or legal tension, they were the product of living under constant surveillance, of knowing that powerful people had taken notice of her, and that in their world, people who knew too much rarely survived unscathed. Her death, which would come under suspicious circumstances, turned her fears into reality. But long before that fateful moment, Emaine had already known the danger she was in. She knew that stepping into the courtroom had put her on a collision course with forces much larger than herself, and her paranoia, far from being a simple emotional response, was an understanding of the dangerous game of power she had unwittingly entered. The trial had exposed the corruption and exploitation at the heart of Italy's political system, but for Imane, it had also exposed her to a life of fear, a fear that, tragically, she would never escape. On March 1st, 2019, Imane Fadil was rushed to the Humanitas hospital in Milan, her body already betraying signs of a deep and insidious illness. What had begun as general discomfort quickly escalated into something far more sinister, her condition deteriorating at an alarming rate, leaving doctors scrambling for answers. To them, her symptoms were puzzling, a medical mystery that only grew more ominous as the days passed. But to Emaine, there was no mystery. She believed with every fiber of her being that she had been poisoned. When she arrived at the hospital, Emaine presented a troubling mix of symptoms: severe abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting signs that initially pointed to a gastrointestinal issue. Yet, as the medical team ran tests, nothing added up. There was no clear diagnosis, no definitive cause that could explain the rapid progression of her illness. Over the next few days, her symptoms worsened. Her skin turned an unnatural shade of yellow, indicating liver failure. Her kidneys began to shut down, and her vision deteriorated. Doctors watched helplessly as her body seemed to fail piece by piece, and with each passing day, the mystery deepened. As the medical team continued to search for answers, Emaine remained convinced that she knew exactly what was happening to her. She confided in those close to her that she believed she had been poisoned, an assertion that would later send shockwaves through both the investigation and the public. Imaine's condition was not the result of an ordinary illness, she claimed, but rather a calculated act designed to silence her for good. In her final days, she told her lawyers and close friends that she had been targeted and that her involvement in the Berlusconi trial had made her a threat to powerful people. Her belief in the poisoning was not baseless paranoia. Imane had been living in fear for months, constantly feeling watched, followed, and monitored. The heightened media attention surrounding the trial, her role as a whistleblower, and the sensitive nature of her testimony all pointed to the possibility that she had become too dangerous to remain alive. "They got me," she reportedly told one of her friends in the hospital. "I knew this would happen." Doctors at the hospital were bewildered by the speed of her decline. They suspected everything from viral infections to autoimmune diseases, but nothing fit the full spectrum of her symptoms. As her organs began to fail, her case became a race against time. Multiple specialists were brought in, and her medical records were scrutinized. But even the most advanced tests could not identify the root cause of her illness. The doctors were left in the dark, struggling to keep her alive while Imaine's condition spiraled out of control. What made her case even more suspicious was the timing. Imane had been relatively healthy before her sudden collapse. Her rapid deterioration, occurring just as the trial against Berlusconi was reaching a critical point, raised alarm bells for those who were following her story closely. The fact that she had repeatedly voiced concerns about her safety, combined with her belief that she had been poisoned, added a layer of fear and suspicion that could not be ignored. The medical team, though initially unaware of her high profile involvement in the Berlusconi trial, soon realized they were dealing with more than just a medical emergency, they were dealing with a potential crime. Toxicology reports were ordered to test for poisons or other toxic substances that could explain her mysterious symptoms, but the results were inconclusive. There were traces of heavy metals in her system, but not enough to definitively point to poisoning. Still, the shadow of foul play loomed large over her death. As her condition worsened, her friends and lawyers grew increasingly alarmed. They knew Imane had been afraid for her life, and now, watching her slip away in such a dramatic and unexplained manner, their fears began to mirror her own. Many believed that her death was no coincidence, that her testimony in the Berlusconi trial had made her too much of a liability. And in the world of high stakes politics, those who knew too much often found themselves at the mercy of unseen forces. On March 15th, after 2 agonizing weeks in the hospital, Imane Fadil passed away. The official cause of death was listed as multiple organ failure, but the question of how and why she had died remained unanswered. Her death cast a long, dark shadow over the already controversial Berlusconi trial, fueling speculation that her demise was no accident, but rather the final act in a long, sinister plot to silence her once and for all. The days leading up to her death were marked by confusion, fear, and unanswered questions. Despite the best efforts of her doctors, no clear cause could be determined in time to save her life. Yet, for those who had known her and for those following the trial, one thing was clear. Imane Fadil had known she was in danger, and her death only deepened the sense of conspiracies surrounding her involvement in one of Italy's most infamous political scandals. Her death would soon ignite a fierce battle between truth and cover up, with many asking the question that would haunt investigators for years to come: who killed Imane Fadil and why? Imane Fadil's arrival at the Humanitas Hospital in Milan on March 1st, 2019, was the beginning of a medical mystery that would baffle doctors and leave her loved ones grasping for answers. The symptoms she presented were initially vague but troubling: severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and extreme fatigue. These could have been signs of a variety of conditions, ranging from food poisoning to an infection. But as her symptoms rapidly worsened, it became clear that something far more serious was happening inside her body. The medical team was left scrambling to uncover what was causing her rapid decline. The first few days were marked by confusion. Doctors administered tests for everything they could think of: bacterial infections, viruses, autoimmune diseases, but nothing provided a clear answer. As the tests came back negative one after another, Imane's condition only grew worse. She began to suffer from jaundice, her skin and eyes taking on a yellowish tint, a clear sign that her liver was failing. Soon after, her kidneys began to shut down and her vision started to blur. Every system in her body seemed to be collapsing, but the cause remained elusive. The frustration among the medical staff was palpable. Here was a young woman in the prime of her life, with no prior serious health issues, yet her body was deteriorating at an alarming rate, and the usual diagnostic pathways were yielding no answers. The doctors turned to more specialized tests, looking for rare diseases or unusual conditions that could explain the rapid failure of her organs. But despite their best efforts, the cause of her illness remained a mystery. The delays in diagnosis were not just a medical issue, they added to the growing fear that Imane herself had been voicing for months. "I think someone is trying to kill me," she had told friends before her hospitalization. Now, as her body continued to fail, the possibility of poisoning began to surface. Imane herself believed she had been poisoned, a claim she made to her doctors and her legal team even as her condition worsened. "They've poisoned me," she reportedly told those close to her, though no one knew exactly who they were. This declaration placed the medical team in an even more difficult position. Poisoning, especially with rare or hard to detect substances, can be extremely difficult to diagnose, and time was not on their side. Toxicology tests were ordered, but they took time to process. Meanwhile, Imane's condition deteriorated so quickly that the medical staff was forced to focus on trying to stabilize her rather than figuring out what was wrong. They treated the symptoms, providing supportive care for her failing organs, but without knowing the root cause, every treatment felt like a shot in the dark. The confusion extended beyond the hospital walls. Those closest to Imane were growing more and more alarmed, convinced that something far more sinister was at play. The timing of her illness, just as she was in the thick of one of Italy's most high-profile trials, raised suspicions that went far beyond natural causes. Poisoning was no longer just a theory, it was becoming the most likely explanation for the mysterious sequence of events. But what kind of poison, and who would have the resources and the motive to carry out such an attack? Doctors began to explore the possibility that Imane had been exposed to heavy metals or radioactive substances, both of which could cause the kind of multi-system organ failure she was experiencing. But even as these possibilities were investigated, time was running out. The toxicology reports were slow to come back, and by the time they arrived, Imane's condition had worsened to the point of no return. Despite every effort to save her, on March 15th, 2 weeks after her hospitalization, Imane Fadil died, leaving behind more questions than answers. The confusion surrounding her death only deepened in the days and weeks that followed. The toxicology reports indicated traces of heavy metals in her system, but not in concentrations typically associated with fatal poisoning. This discrepancy left the medical community and investigators at a loss. Had she been poisoned with something so rare or so carefully administered that it had evaded detection? Or was there another explanation entirely, one that had yet to be uncovered? The mystery of Imane's illness became as much a part of the story as the trials she had been involved in. Her rapid deterioration, the inability of doctors to pinpoint the cause, and her own fear that she had been poisoned all combined to create an atmosphere of deep suspicion. For those who had followed her story from the beginning, it seemed too coincidental that a woman who had spoken out against one of Italy's most powerful men would suddenly fall gravely ill in the midst of the trial. The idea of poisoning, once a distant possibility, now became the dominant theory. The medical team, despite their best efforts, had been unable to save Imane, and they were left as bewildered as everyone else. The tests had shown anomalies, but nothing conclusive. It was as if the truth of what had happened to her was slipping through their fingers just out of reach. And with Imane's death, the chance to uncover that truth seemed to vanish as well, leaving only speculation, suspicion, and a deep sense of unease. Had Imane Fadil been poisoned? The toxicology results, the timeline of her illness, and her own haunting words all pointed in that direction, but the evidence remained elusive. What was clear, however, was that her death was no ordinary medical case. It was the final chapter in a story of power, corruption, and fear, a story that had claimed one life and left the rest of the world searching for answers. In the days following Imane Fadil's untimely death, the mystery surrounding her sudden illness deepened, prompting authorities to take a closer look at the circumstances. Imane's repeated claims that she had been poisoned, combined with the rapid deterioration of her health, left too many unanswered questions for her death to be written off as a mere medical anomaly. The stakes were too high, the timing too convenient, and the suspicions too grave. The forensic investigation that followed would open the door to a dark, twisting narrative filled with suspicion, science, and political intrigue. Immediately after her passing on March 15th, 2019, forensic experts were brought in to conduct a detailed autopsy and toxicological analysis. The goal was clear: to determine whether foul play had been involved in her death. Imane's high-profile role in the ongoing Berlusconi trials had already raised concerns that her death might not have been a tragic accident but an intentional act of silencing. The fact that Imane herself had voiced fears of being poisoned only added fuel to the fire, making it imperative for investigators to rule out or confirm the possibility of murder. The autopsy began with a thorough examination of her organs, which had all shown signs of failure in the days leading up to her death. What puzzled forensic experts was the extent of the damage. Her liver, kidneys, and other vital organs had been severely compromised, but there was no immediate, clear cut explanation as to why. The toxicology tests became the key to unlocking what had happened inside her body, and soon enough, these tests began to reveal something startling. Initial forensic findings pointed to the presence of radioactive substances in Imane's system, a discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation. The detection of radioactive materials, particularly polonium, raised immediate concerns. Polonium is a rare and highly toxic substance, often associated with state sponsored assassinations, the most notorious case being the death of former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko in 2006. Its presence in Imane's body suggested that she might have been exposed to a poison far more deadly and far more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. The radioactive elements found in her system were in low quantities, but enough to raise significant alarm. Forensic experts knew that radioactive poisoning is difficult to detect and can cause multi organ failure, exactly what Imane had experienced in the final days of her life. This discovery led investigators to consider whether she had been deliberately targeted by individuals with access to such rare substances. The question now became who would have had both the resources and the motivation to carry out such a calculated act. The forensic team, under immense pressure to find answers, expanded their analysis. They tested for various other poisons, heavy metals, and toxins, but the radioactive findings remained the most significant. The presence of these substances pointed to something much more deliberate than a random poisoning. It hinted at a method typically associated with professional or state level assassinations. The detection of these substances raised new questions about the extent of the conspiracy that might have been at play in Imane's death. The forensic investigation also took into account Imane's own testimony in the weeks before her death. She had been adamant that she was being watched and that she feared for her life. This, combined with the forensic findings, painted a chilling picture of a woman who had been marked for death. The radioactive substances suggested a plot that had been carefully planned, likely carried out by individuals with both the expertise and the intent to ensure that Imane Fadil would never be able to testify in court again. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that this was no ordinary poisoning case. The complexity of the forensic findings, the political backdrop of the Berlusconi trial, and the presence of radioactive substances all pointed to foul play. Imane's death had now become a matter of national and even international concern, as the use of such rare and dangerous materials raised questions about who might have been responsible and how far they were willing to go to silence her. But even as the forensic team continued to probe deeper into the cause of her death, they were left with more questions than answers. The radioactive findings, while significant, did not definitively point to how or when Imane had been poisoned. Had she been exposed to these substances gradually over time, or had a single lethal dose been administered to her shortly before her hospitalization? The answers remained elusive, and with them the full truth of what had happened to Imane Fadil. What was clear, however, was that the discovery of radioactive substances changed everything. It transformed her death from a medical mystery into a full-scale investigation, one that implicated powerful individuals and raised the specter of a high-stakes conspiracy. Imane Fadil, once a key witness in a political scandal, had now become the centerpiece of a potential murder plot, with forensic evidence pointing to a poisoning far more sinister than anyone had initially imagined. And as the investigation deepened, so did the questions surrounding her death, questions that would continue to haunt both the public and the investigators for years to come. As news of Imane Fadil's mysterious death spread, the possibility that she had been poisoned became the focal point of a growing investigation. Her sudden, unexplained illness, paired with her own assertions that she had been targeted, left little room for doubt in the minds of those who had followed her story. This was not a natural death. The investigation into her possible poisoning quickly escalated, with toxicology reports becoming the key to unraveling the truth. The toxicology tests conducted after her death revealed traces of heavy metals in her system, including cadmium and antimony, which can be highly toxic when present in large amounts. These metals are known to cause symptoms similar to those Imane experienced: abdominal pain, vomiting, liver and kidney failure, and eventual death. While these findings were significant, they did not provide the complete picture. The levels of heavy metals found in Imane's body were not high enough to immediately confirm that they were the direct cause of her death, leaving investigators to speculate whether the poison had been administered in small, gradual doses over time. But the most alarming discovery came in the form of radioactive substances detected during the toxicology analysis. As previously mentioned, small quantities of radioactive materials, including polonium, were found in her system. Polonium is a highly toxic, rare element that is difficult to detect and lethal even in minute quantities. Its association with state sponsored assassinations, such as the case of Alexander Litvinenko, immediately raised suspicions that Imane's death was no accident but the result of a carefully orchestrated plan to silence her. The forensic experts and toxicologists working on the case explored several potential methods by which the poison could have been administered. One theory suggested that the poisoning had been slow and deliberate, with the toxins gradually accumulating in her system over several weeks or months. This would explain why Imane had complained of feeling unwell long before she was admitted to the hospital, and why her condition worsened so quickly once she was there. It's possible that small doses of heavy metals or radioactive substances had been introduced into her food or drink over time, weakening her body until it could no longer fight back. Another theory proposed that Imane had been poisoned in a single concentrated dose shortly before she was hospitalized. Experts speculated that someone could have laced her food or drink with a lethal mixture of toxins, perhaps at one of the many social events she attended in the days leading up to her illness. The slow onset of symptoms, combined with the difficulty in detecting certain poisons, would have made it nearly impossible for doctors to identify the cause before it was too late. The investigators also considered the possibility that Imane had been exposed to radioactive substances in a more sophisticated manner, perhaps through contaminated objects or surfaces that she had come into contact with. Polonium, for example, can be introduced into the body through ingestion, inhalation, or skin contact, making it an ideal weapon for an assassination that needed to be both covert and difficult to trace. The use of such a rare and dangerous substance suggested a level of planning and expertise that pointed to powerful, resourceful individuals or groups. As toxicologists delved deeper into the results, they consulted with experts on poisons and assassination methods. Speculation abounded about who might have had both the means and the motive to carry out such an attack. The presence of radioactive substances suggested that this was not the work of an amateur. Poisoning with polonium, in particular, is often associated with intelligence agencies or individuals with access to high level resources. The implication was chilling. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that Imane Fadil would not live to see the end of the Berlusconi trial. The investigation into her possible poisoning also drew on historical cases of political assassinations involving poison. From the Cold War era killings carried out by the KGB to more recent high profile murders involving dissidents and whistleblowers, the use of poison has long been favored by those seeking to eliminate enemies quietly and efficiently. Poison allows for plausible deniability, making it difficult to prove intent or trace the act back to a specific individual or group. In Imane's case, the toxicology results indicated that someone had used this deadly method to silence her, but the exact details remained elusive. For investigators, the most pressing question was how the poison had been administered and by whom. Had Imane been aware that she was being slowly poisoned, or had the attack taken her by surprise? Her fear of being watched and followed, her repeated claims that she was in danger, these were not the words of a paranoid woman, but of someone who understood the gravity of the situation she was in. And now, with the toxicology reports in hand, those fears seemed all the more justified. Despite the toxicology findings, the case remained frustratingly complex. While the presence of heavy metals and radioactive substances pointed to foul play, they did not provide a clear timeline or method. The exact source of the poison remained a mystery, and without definitive proof, the investigation was left to piece together the fragments of Imane's final days. The speculation continued as experts weighed in on the possibilities. Some believed that the poisoning had been a deliberate, calculated act by individuals close to Imane, perhaps even someone she trusted. Others theorized that she had been targeted by powerful figures within Berlusconi's circle, desperate to silence her before she could reveal more damaging information. The investigation was a labyrinth of potential suspects, motives, and methods, each more chilling than the last. What was clear, however, was that Imane Fadil's death was no accident. The toxicology reports, combined with her own fears and the political context of the Berlusconi trial, painted a picture of a woman who had been marked for death. The investigation into her possible poisoning would continue, but the evidence already pointed to a conclusion that was hard to ignore. Imane Fadil had been silenced, and whoever had orchestrated her death had done so with chilling precision. The news of Imane Fadil's sudden death sent shockwaves through Italy, not only among the public, but also within the halls of government and law enforcement. A key witness in the high profile trial of Silvio Berlusconi, her passing raised immediate suspicions. Yet, the reactions from Italian authorities, both government officials and law enforcement, were marked by a troubling combination of initial reluctance and carefully managed urgency, as if the powers that be were unsure how to handle the explosive potential of her death. When news broke on March 15th, 2019, that Imane had died under suspicious circumstances, there was an eerie silence from official channels at first. Her role in the Berlusconi trial had already placed her in a precarious position, and her previous public statements about fearing for her life only made her death more unsettling. Yet, despite these obvious red flags, there seemed to be a cautious approach from law enforcement in launching a full scale investigation. For many, the reluctance of Italian authorities to immediately act with the urgency her case demanded was a cause for concern. Initial reports from law enforcement suggested that there was hesitation in treating her death as a potential crime. Some critics speculated that this reluctance stemmed from the high profile nature of the trial and the political and social implications of admitting that a key witness could have been poisoned. After all, implicating powerful individuals in what could be a targeted assassination was no small matter, especially when those individuals sat at the top of Italy's political hierarchy. Imane's death came at a delicate time in Italian politics, and the initial response reflected the tightrope that authorities were walking. In the days following her death, there was a clear attempt to downplay any immediate connection between her passing and the Berlusconi trial. Early statements from government officials and police indicated that they were waiting for more information from medical professionals before determining whether foul play was involved. It was as though the very idea of poisoning was too politically explosive to acknowledge without concrete proof. However, as toxicology reports began to reveal the presence of heavy metals and radioactive substances in Imane's system, the tone began to shift. Law enforcement could no longer ignore the possibility that her death was the result of deliberate poisoning. The investigation, which had initially been slow to gain momentum, suddenly took on a more urgent tone. Public pressure was mounting, and authorities knew they could no longer afford to appear indifferent or inactive. The government's response was similarly cautious. While officials expressed their condolences, there was a noticeable lack of strong, definitive statements regarding the nature of Imane's death in the immediate aftermath. It was as if they were waiting for the dust to settle before fully addressing the implications. Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte's government, which had been critical of Berlusconi's legacy, was aware of the political minefield they were entering. Investigating the death of a key witness in the ongoing trial of a former prime minister was not only a sensitive issue, but one that could further destabilize the already volatile political climate. Behind the scenes, however, the tension was palpable. Italy's law enforcement agencies, including the Carabinieri and the Milan prosecutor's office, were under immense pressure to deliver answers. As the toxicology reports circulated and the suspicion of foul play gained traction, authorities found themselves in a difficult position. Public trust was at stake, and any sign of a cover up or reluctance to act would fuel accusations of corruption within the system. To address this growing tension, law enforcement began to take visible action. The Milan prosecutor's office opened an official investigation into Imane's death, acknowledging that poisoning was now a leading theory. This shift marked a significant change in the official narrative, with authorities no longer able to dismiss the possibility of foul play. They ordered more forensic tests, including further toxicology analyses and in depth reviews of her medical records, seeking to uncover any traces of suspicious substances that could explain her rapid decline. Despite this late shift in tone, there remained a lingering question of why it had taken so long for law enforcement to treat Imane's case with the urgency it deserved. Some critics argued that the initial reluctance was an attempt to avoid further damaging Italy's reputation, particularly as the Berlusconi trial had already drawn international attention. Others suggested that law enforcement had been cautious not to rush to conclusions that could implicate powerful figures without irrefutable evidence. The delay in fully launching an investigation led to widespread speculation that the authorities were treading carefully, perhaps fearing the political fallout that would come with confirming that Imane Fadil had been poisoned. After all, if a key witness in one of Italy's most important trials had been murdered, it would cast a long shadow over the judicial process and raise questions about the safety of those who dared to testify against the rich and powerful. By the time law enforcement began treating her death as suspicious, the damage had already been done. The slow initial response had fueled conspiracy theories and deepened public distrust in the system. And though authorities eventually ramped up their efforts, including interviews with her friends, colleagues, and those who had been close to her in her final days, the lingering sense of reluctance remained. The Italian government, too, was forced to address the growing speculation, but their response was measured. While they called for a thorough investigation, they refrained from making any direct accusations. It was as if everyone involved, from the police to the politicians, was waiting for someone else to make the first move, unwilling to bear the full weight of the explosive truth that could be lying just beneath the surface. In the end, the reaction from Italian authorities to Imane Fadil's death was a delicate balancing act. Initially slow and cautious, they were eventually forced to confront the very real possibility that this was not a natural death. But the hesitation and reluctance in those early days left a lasting impact, one that would fuel doubt and suspicion about how much the government and law enforcement were willing to reveal and just how deep this conspiracy might go. As investigators dug deeper into the mysterious death of Imane Fadil, one unsettling question loomed large. Could her death be directly tied to Silvio Berlusconi's inner circle? For months, Imane had been a crucial witness in the high-profile trial of the former prime minister, her testimony pulling back the curtain on the infamous Bunga Bunga parties and exposing the dark, exploitative side of Berlusconi's world. Her sudden death just before the conclusion of the trial seemed too coincidental for many to accept as anything other than a deliberate act of silencing. But who within Berlusconi's powerful network would have the motive and the means to orchestrate such a plot? Berlusconi's inner circle was no ordinary group. It was a web of high-powered businessmen, political allies, media moguls, and even members of organized crime, all of whom had benefited from his decades-long reign in Italian politics. Over the years, Berlusconi had built an empire of influence, one that extended beyond the political arena and into the realms of media, finance, and personal relationships. This inner circle had helped insulate him from scandal after scandal, ensuring that accusations from corruption to sexual misconduct either evaporated or resulted in minor consequences. But Imane Fadil's testimony had threatened to break that protective barrier. Imane had detailed the behind the scenes reality of Berlusconi's infamous parties, describing how young women, often vulnerable and in need of money or opportunity, were used to entertain powerful men. Her testimony wasn't just an embarrassment, it was a direct threat to the reputation and legal standing of some of the most influential figures in Italy. She had spoken of coercion, of money being exchanged for sexual favors, and of a culture of exploitation that had been carefully shielded from public view. Her role in the trial had the potential to bring down not just Berlusconi, but others in his orbit who had taken part in or enabled this behavior. The possibility that members of Berlusconi's inner circle had a hand in her death became a key angle of the investigation. After all, the stakes were enormous. If Imane's testimony had been fully aired in court, it could have led to additional charges not just against Berlusconi, but against those who had participated in the events she described. There was also the looming threat of civil lawsuits from other victims emboldened by her courage, who might have been waiting for the right moment to come forward. Silencing Imane could have been a way to cut off the most damaging testimony before it could ripple further. One of the first lines of inquiry involved looking at Berlusconi's most trusted associates, men and women who had been deeply involved in his political career and his personal life. Some of these figures had been named during the trial, their attendance at the parties well documented. Investigators began to piece together whether any of these individuals had direct contact with Imane in the weeks leading up to her hospitalization. Were there conversations, meetings, or unexplained interactions that could point to a motive for silencing her? While no immediate smoking gun emerged, whispers of intimidation tactics floated to the surface. There were rumors that several women involved in the trial had been pressured to stay silent or retract their statements. Imane herself had spoken of feeling watched, of sensing that she was being followed, and of receiving veiled threats. These fears seemed to suggest that someone within Berlusconi's network was keeping close tabs on her, ensuring that she didn't reveal more than she had already shared. And as her testimony grew more damning, the pressure on her increased. Another angle of the investigation explored the role of intermediaries, those who acted as go betweens for Berlusconi and his network, ensuring that the flow of information and influence remained tightly controlled. Some of these individuals were linked to organized crime, a connection that had long been suspected but never fully proven. The use of poison as a method of silencing a witness was not unheard of in these circles, especially when the target was someone whose silence was worth more than their life. Could it have been someone from this shadowy underworld acting on behalf of powerful figures who had orchestrated the poisoning? The forensic evidence pointing to radioactive substances in Imane's body only added to the suspicion that this was no ordinary case of intimidation. Poisoning with such rare and dangerous materials suggested a level of sophistication and access that only a select few would possess. The idea that a member of Berlusconi's circle had the resources to obtain and administer such a poison was not far-fetched. After all, Berlusconi's influence had extended into every corner of Italian society, and the people closest to him were no strangers to navigating the dark underbelly of power. Motivations for silencing Imane were also examined from a financial perspective. Berlusconi's empire was built on a network of business interests that spanned media, construction, and finance, much of which had been shielded from public scrutiny through his political connections. If Imane's testimony had led to more revelations about the inner workings of his personal and professional life, it could have triggered investigations that reached far beyond the parties. Individuals who had financially benefited from their association with Berlusconi had every reason to ensure that Imane's voice was silenced before it could unravel the delicate threads of their fortunes. Even more chilling was the possibility that her death was not just about protecting Berlusconi, but about sending a message to others. If someone within his circle had been responsible for poisoning Imane, it would have been a powerful warning to anyone else who might have considered testifying against him. In the world of high stakes politics and crime, silencing one witness often serves as a deterrent to others, making it clear that the cost of speaking out is far greater than the reward. As the investigation into her death continued, the focus remained on Berlusconi's inner circle and the intricate web of influence and control that surrounded him. The ties between these powerful figures and Imane's untimely death grew harder to ignore, though concrete evidence remained elusive. What was clear, however, was that Imane Fadil had posed a real threat to this network, one that was not willing to leave anything to chance. In the end, while direct connections between Berlusconi's closest allies and Imane's death have never been definitively proven, the circumstantial evidence was enough to raise serious doubts. Her death, under such suspicious circumstances, left an indelible mark on the trial and on Italy's political landscape. Whether through direct orders or indirect pressure, it became increasingly clear that someone had a vested interest in ensuring that Imane Fadil would never finish telling her story. And in the shadows of that inner circle, the motive to silence her was all too real. Italy, in the years leading up to Imane Fadil's death, was a country grappling with deep rooted political corruption and a history of power struggles between the elite and the public. Silvio Berlusconi, the controversial former prime minister, had long been at the center of this storm. His political career, characterized by charm, controversy, and scandal, epitomized the complex relationship between power, media influence, and personal wealth in Italy. Imane Fadil's case was not just the tragic death of a key witness, it was a window into the wider issue of how power operated behind closed doors and how corruption worked to suppress those who threatened the status quo. Berlusconi's rise to power was built on his vast media empire, giving him unprecedented control over public opinion through newspapers, television stations, and advertising. His government was often accused of blurring the line between personal gain and public service, with accusations of corruption, bribery, and the manipulation of laws to suit his own interests. Over the years, his name became synonymous with scandals, many of them linked to allegations of illegal dealings, sexual misconduct, and exploitation. Yet, despite the endless controversies, Berlusconi managed to survive politically thanks to a loyal base of supporters and a network of allies who benefited from his protection and wealth. Italy's political landscape at the time of Imane Fadil's death was volatile. The country had undergone significant changes, with new anti-establishment parties like the Five Star Movement and Matteo Salvini's League Party rising to prominence by exploiting public anger over corruption and economic stagnation. However, Berlusconi remained a towering figure in the Italian political scene, representing a system where power, money, and influence often trumped justice. The political environment was ripe with allegations of corruption, with many seeing Berlusconi's continued prominence as a symbol of Italy's inability to escape the grip of its corrupt political elite. Imane Fadil's death landed squarely in this toxic political climate where suspicion, power, and silence intertwined. Her involvement in the Bunga Bunga trial exposed her to the harsh reality of Italy's political machinery, where inconvenient witnesses were often seen as disposable, their voices suppressed in the face of larger interests. The timing of her death, coming just as she was set to deliver damning testimony against Berlusconi, raised immediate concerns about the lengths to which those in power would go to protect themselves. For decades, Italy had been plagued by accusations of systemic corruption, especially within its political class. The country had seen politicians from all levels of government embroiled in scandals involving bribery, organized crime, and misuse of public funds. It was in this context that Berlusconi thrived, often seen as the ultimate embodiment of political and financial power wielded without consequence. He was infamous for using his position to manipulate the law, often passing legislation that shielded him from prosecution. His close ties to powerful businessmen, media moguls, and even members of the mafia only deepened the perception that he operated in a space where the rules did not apply. Imane Fadil's testimony threatened to destabilize this carefully controlled world. As a key witness in the trial, she had the potential to expose not only Berlusconi's personal indiscretions, but also the broader web of corruption and exploitation that surrounded him. Her revelations about the exploitation of young women at his parties went beyond personal misconduct. They hinted at a system where power was abused for personal pleasure, and where those who facilitated this abuse were protected by wealth and influence. Berlusconi's inner circle, many of whom had financial and political stakes in maintaining his reputation, had every reason to fear what Imane could reveal. Her testimony could have pulled back the curtain on more than just the parties. It could have exposed the network of corruption that had enabled Berlusconi to evade accountability for so long. And in a political environment where corruption was rampant, suppressing inconvenient witnesses had become a troublingly common practice. The death of witnesses or whistleblowers in cases involving powerful figures is not unheard of in Italy's political history. The country has long struggled with the influence of organized crime, particularly the mafia, and its connections to political power. Over the years, there have been numerous instances where individuals who dared to challenge the powerful found themselves silenced, sometimes through intimidation, other times through far more tragic means. In this sense, Imane's death fit a troubling pattern. Those who threaten the foundations of power often do not live to tell their story. The political intrigue surrounding Imane Fadil's death highlighted the fragility of justice in a country where corruption could reach into the highest levels of government. Her claims of being followed, her fear of being poisoned, and the discovery of radioactive substances in her system pointed to a much larger conspiracy, one that went beyond the Bunga Bunga trial and into the dark underbelly of Italy's political elite. This was not just about protecting Berlusconi, it was about protecting the entire system that had allowed him and others like him to operate with impunity for so long. The investigation into Imane's death also revealed the challenges faced by law enforcement in a country where political interference was a constant threat. Although the Milan prosecutor's office eventually launched a formal investigation, there were whispers that elements within the government and law enforcement were reluctant to push too hard. After all, Berlusconi still wielded significant influence, and the political fallout of proving that a key witness in his trial had been murdered could shake the foundations of Italy's already fragile political system. For the public, Imane Fadil became more than just a witness. She became a symbol of the dangers of speaking truth to power in a country where corruption and political intrigue were often two sides of the same coin. Her death raised uncomfortable questions about who was really in control and whether justice could ever truly be served in a system so deeply entrenched in corruption. In the larger narrative of Italian politics, her case was a chilling reminder that, for those at the top, the price of silence was often paid in blood. In the end, Imane's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a reflection of a political system that had long placed power and self preservation above justice. Her story, one of courage, fear, and untimely death, became another chapter in Italy's ongoing struggle with the corruption that has haunted its political landscape for generations. And as the investigation continued, one question lingered: how far would the powerful go to protect themselves from the truth Imane Fadil had sought to expose? The death of Imane Fadil, a key witness in Silvio Berlusconi's trial, set off a media firestorm that quickly transcended Italy's borders, captivating audiences around the world. What had begun as a lurid scandal involving a former Italian prime minister, his infamous Bunga Bunga parties, and allegations of sexual exploitation quickly evolved into a much darker narrative. Imane's sudden death turned the story from one of scandalous testimony to a possible case of political assassination, and the international media seized on this explosive new angle with fervor. In Italy, the media was already deeply entrenched in covering every twist and turn of the Berlusconi trial. Berlusconi had long been a divisive figure in the country, with his media empire and political power granting him a level of control over the national conversation that few could match. His influence was such that Italian news outlets often handled stories involving him with a mix of caution and sensationalism. The coverage of Imane Fadil's role as a witness had been extensive, particularly in the months leading up to her death, as she was seen as one of the key figures who could finally bring to light the sordid details of Berlusconi's private life. But when news broke that she had died under suspicious circumstances, the Italian media found itself in uncharted territory. The shift was immediate and dramatic. Imane was no longer just a young model caught up in a political trial. She was now a victim, possibly of a political assassination meant to silence her forever. Headlines in Italian newspapers like Corriere della Sera and La Repubblica reflected the growing suspicion that her death was not a mere coincidence. The words poisoning and murder started to appear in coverage, and as the toxicology reports began to leak details of radioactive substances found in her system, the story took on a life of its own. For the Italian media, this was more than just another twist in the Berlusconi saga. It was a potential scandal of historic proportions. If proven that Imane had been murdered, it would suggest that those involved in the highest levels of Italian politics were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect themselves from damaging testimony. News programs and talk shows across the country debated the implications of her death, with pundits and experts weighing in on the possibility that Italy's political elite had, once again, been touched by the shadow of foul play. In Morocco, where Imane was born, the reaction was more personal. Imane's death was covered extensively in Moroccan outlets like Limaten and Telquil, where the focus was on her journey from a Moroccan immigrant in Italy to a model caught up in one of Europe's most infamous political scandals. Moroccan media portrayed her not just as a victim of political corruption, but as a young woman whose life had been tragically cut short by forces beyond her control. Her death resonated deeply with many Moroccans, particularly those in the diaspora, as it symbolized the vulnerabilities faced by immigrants trying to make a life for themselves abroad. For Morocco, this was not just about Berlusconi or Italian politics, it was about the loss of one of their own. The international media, however, took a broader view, framing Imane's death within the context of global political corruption and the lengths powerful men would go to protect themselves. Major outlets like the New York Times, The Guardian, and Le Monde highlighted the eerie parallels between her death and other high profile cases where witnesses or whistleblowers met untimely and suspicious ends. The comparison to cases like the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in London or the death of Russian opposition figures was unavoidable. The presence of radioactive substances in Imane's system only heightened these comparisons, as many began to wonder whether her death was a state sponsored assassination or the work of private individuals with significant resources. In France, Le Monde and Liberation focused on the broader implications of Imane's death, framing it as part of a larger European struggle with corruption and the abuse of power. French media tended to focus on the idea that Imane had been silenced because her testimony threatened the very fabric of Italy's political system, a system long plagued by scandals and allegations of corruption at the highest levels. The French coverage was particularly critical of the Italian government's slow response to investigating her death, pointing to it as an example of how corruption often stifles justice. In the United Kingdom, The Guardian and The Times explored the sensational aspects of the case while also questioning whether Berlusconi's inner circle could have been involved in her death. British media had always been fascinated with Berlusconi's colorful and scandalous political career, and Imane's death added another layer of intrigue to his already infamous legacy. The British press, always eager to uncover stories of political corruption, dug deep into the potential motivations behind her death, speculating on who in Berlusconi's network stood to benefit the most from her silence. In the United States, outlets like CNN and the New York Times framed the story as part of a broader international narrative about the abuse of power and the silencing of inconvenient voices. The American media, while intrigued by the salacious details of the Bunga Bunga parties, placed greater emphasis on the political ramifications of Imane's death, noting that this was not just an Italian scandal, but a reflection of how wealth and influence can manipulate justice anywhere in the world. The possibility that Imane had been poisoned in a manner reminiscent of state sponsored killings added a level of gravity to the story that elevated it beyond the tabloid fare it might have otherwise become. Across all countries, the narrative around Imane Fadil shifted dramatically after her death. No longer was she just a model with a scandalous story to tell, she became a symbol of what happens when powerful men fear exposure. The international media, in its coverage, transformed her from a witness in a political trial to a victim of a potentially deadly conspiracy, one that reflected the darkest corners of political corruption and suppression. The global fascination with her case also reignited discussions about the safety of witnesses and whistleblowers in high stakes political cases. Many media outlets pointed out that Imane was not the first, and likely would not be the last, person to pay the ultimate price for speaking out against those in power. Her death underscored the fragility of truth in the face of overwhelming wealth and influence, and the media's role in keeping these stories alive even when the witnesses themselves no longer could. The coverage of Imane Fadil's death reflected the broader concern about the intersection of politics, power, and justice. Whether in Italy, Morocco, or abroad, the message was clear. Imane's death was more than just the tragic end of a young woman's life. It was a chilling reminder of the lengths to which the powerful might go to protect their secrets, and in a world where the media serves as the voice of the silenced, her story would not be forgotten easily. As the investigation into Imane Fadil's death progressed, one of the most chilling discoveries came from the toxicology reports. Traces of radioactive substances were found in her body. This revelation shifted the narrative from speculation about possible poisoning to a much more specific and terrifying theory: had she been deliberately poisoned using radioactive elements? The idea evoked immediate comparisons to other high profile cases of radioactive poisoning, most notably the death of former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, and cast a dark shadow over the entire investigation. The presence of radioactive materials, particularly polonium, immediately raised questions about how Imane could have been exposed to such a rare and deadly substance. Polonium 210, the specific isotope that had been detected in Litvinenko's case, is an extraordinarily toxic and highly radioactive element. It is so dangerous that even a minuscule amount, just a few micrograms, can be lethal. Once ingested, inhaled, or absorbed through the skin, it irradiates the body from the inside, causing severe organ failure and ultimately death. The symptoms Imane had experienced, abdominal pain, organ failure, and a rapid decline in health, were consistent with what would be expected from radioactive poisoning. But how had such a deadly material found its way into Imane Fadil's system? This was no ordinary toxin that could be easily obtained or administered. Polonium is produced in nuclear reactors and is typically used in industrial applications such as power generation or space exploration. Its rarity and the complexity of acquiring it led investigators to believe that whoever poisoned Imane had access to significant resources likely beyond the capabilities of an ordinary individual. The possibility of state sponsored involvement or connections to organized crime with ties to illegal sources of radioactive materials became a disturbing and very real consideration. The forensic exploration into the radioactive poisoning theory began with analyzing the specific isotopes detected in Imane's body. Radioactive poisoning is notoriously difficult to detect, particularly because it mimics symptoms of other illnesses and can cause widespread organ failure before it is identified. In Imane's case, the forensic team conducted extensive tests on her blood, tissues, and organs to determine the type and concentration of radioactive substances present. The results showed traces of heavy metals and radiation, though not in concentrations as high as in the Litvinenko case. Still, the mere presence of these materials was enough to raise alarms. Scientists involved in the investigation speculated about the possible methods by which Imane could have been exposed to radioactive elements. One theory suggested that she may have ingested or inhaled the substance at a social event or meeting, perhaps via contaminated food or drink. Polonium 210, for example, can be dissolved in water or other liquids, making it nearly impossible to detect by taste or smell. Once inside the body, it releases alpha particles that damage internal tissues and organs, leading to the type of rapid deterioration that Imane experienced. Another possibility was that the radioactive material had been applied to a surface Imane had come into contact with, such as a personal item, phone, or even clothing. Polonium can also be absorbed through the skin in small amounts, though this method is less common. If someone had applied a minute quantity to an object she regularly used, it could have entered her body gradually, leading to the slow onset of symptoms. This method would have required careful planning and precise execution, but it would align with the slow and deliberate nature of her poisoning. Investigators also explored potential sources for the radioactive materials. While the polonium used in industrial settings is tightly controlled and monitored, black market access to such substances is not unheard of. Organized crime syndicates and rogue states have, in the past, been implicated in illegal trafficking of radioactive materials, raising the possibility that someone with ties to these networks could have acquired the substance and used it to eliminate Imane. The level of sophistication required to execute such a poisoning suggested that this was no amateur job. It pointed to individuals or groups with both the motive and the means to pull off a complex, highly secretive attack. The credibility of the radioactive poisoning theory was further supported by the fact that Imane had repeatedly expressed fear for her life, specifically stating that she believed she was being poisoned. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had told friends, lawyers, and medical professionals that she suspected foul play, citing her role in the ongoing Berlusconi trial as the reason she was being targeted. The presence of radioactive materials in her system only confirmed the chilling possibility that her fears were justified and that someone had acted on the threats she felt looming over her. The use of radioactive substances also fit a disturbing pattern seen in other high profile assassinations where the goal was not just to eliminate the target but to send a clear and terrifying message. Poisoning with polonium, in particular, is often viewed as a signature method of state sponsored killings, particularly those involving intelligence services or criminal organizations. The subtlety of the poison, combined with its delayed and often undetectable effects, makes it a weapon of choice for those who want to silence without immediate suspicion. In Imane's case, the discovery of radioactive elements in her system suggested that her death was not just a crime of passion or opportunity, it was a carefully orchestrated attack designed to ensure her silence. However, not all investigators were convinced that radioactive poisoning was the definitive cause of death. Some experts pointed out that while the presence of radioactive materials in her system was concerning, the levels detected were lower than what would typically result in death by radiation. This led to speculation that she may have been exposed to a combination of poisons, possibly both radioactive and chemical, that worked in tandem to destroy her body from within. The complexity of her symptoms and the lack of clear answers fueled ongoing debate about the exact nature of her poisoning, leaving the investigation with more questions than answers. Ultimately, the theory that Imane Fadil was poisoned with radioactive substances remains one of the most compelling and credible explanations for her sudden death. The scientific evidence, combined with her own fears and the political context surrounding her testimony, strongly suggested that she had been targeted in a manner meant to evade immediate detection. Whether the radioactive poisoning was the sole cause or part of a larger cocktail of poisons, it pointed to a carefully planned and sinister plot to silence her before she could reveal more damaging details in the Berlusconi trial. The forensic exploration of radioactive poisoning in Imane Fadil's case underscored the chilling reality of how far powerful individuals or organizations might go to protect their secrets. Her death, marked by the presence of one of the world's most lethal substances, became a symbol of the dangers that come with standing up against entrenched power. And while the investigation into her death continues, the radioactive poisoning theory remains a haunting reminder that, in the world of political intrigue, the most dangerous enemies are often invisible. Following the sudden and suspicious death of Imane Fadil, all eyes turned to Silvio Berlusconi, the man at the center of the political scandal in which Fadil had played such a pivotal role. As news of her death spread and speculation about foul play grew, the pressure mounted on Berlusconi to respond publicly. His statements in the days and weeks following Fadil's passing were marked by a tone of vehement denial, as he sought to distance himself from any implication that her death had anything to do with him or his inner circle. Berlusconi, known for his larger than life persona and his ability to manipulate media narratives, was quick to dismiss any connection between Fadil's death and the ongoing trial. In his first public remarks, he expressed deep sorrow over her passing, but was adamant that he had never met her personally, stating, "I never knew this person, I never met her." This assertion was an attempt to downplay the role Fadil had played in the trial, suggesting that whatever had happened to her had no connection to him directly. His statement was crafted to deflect attention from the more troubling questions surrounding her death, especially as the toxicology reports began to surface and rumors of poisoning took hold in the media. As Berlusconi continued to deny any involvement, he framed himself as a victim of yet another baseless attack, part of a larger campaign to tarnish his reputation. "I have nothing to do with this tragic event," he said, claiming that his political enemies were using Fadil's death to smear him further. This was a familiar tactic for Berlusconi, who had long positioned himself as a target of politically motivated investigations and legal battles. He argued that the media was sensationalizing her death to reignite the scandals surrounding the Bunga Bunga parties in an effort to damage his already battered political career. However, his statements did little to quell public suspicion. For many, Berlusconi's denial only served to reinforce the idea that there was something far more sinister at play. The Italian media, which had been covering the trial and Fadil's testimony extensively, shifted their focus to Berlusconi's possible connections to her death. While Berlusconi insisted that he had never known her personally, it was well established that Fadil had been a key witness in a trial that could have brought serious legal consequences for him. The public and the press were not quick to dismiss the idea that Fadil's death was somehow linked to the scandals surrounding Berlusconi. Newspapers like La Repubblica and Corriere della Sera ran headlines questioning the timing and circumstances of her death, with some suggesting that her passing was far too convenient for Berlusconi, who had much to lose if her testimony fully came to light. The revelation that radioactive substances were found in Fadil's system further fueled suspicions that her death had been orchestrated by powerful individuals who feared what she might reveal. While no direct evidence pointed to Berlusconi himself, the fact that she had died during a critical moment in the trial cast a long shadow over his denial. Public reaction to Berlusconi's remarks was divided, as it often had been throughout his career. His loyal supporters, many of whom had stood by him through years of scandal and legal trouble, were quick to accept his version of events, echoing his claims that the media and political establishment were out to get him. They argued that Fadil's death, while tragic, was being used as a political tool to further discredit Berlusconi and weaken his position in Italian politics. However, for much of the Italian public, and particularly for those critical of Berlusconi's legacy, his denial rang hollow. Berlusconi's long history of legal battles, scandals, and allegations of corruption made it difficult for many to believe that he had no knowledge of or connection to the events surrounding Fadil's death. The narrative of a politically motivated assassination, or at least a cover up, began to gain traction in public discourse, with many questioning whether Fadil's death was the result of a concerted effort to protect powerful men from the consequences of their actions. International media also reacted with skepticism. Outlets like The Guardian and the New York Times picked up on Berlusconi's statements, noting that his denial of any connection to Fadel, while predictable, did little to address the larger questions surrounding her death. The global press, particularly in countries with a strong interest in political corruption and state sponsored crimes, speculated on the possibility that Fadel had been silenced by individuals within Berlusconi's orbit who feared the damaging impact of her testimony. Legally, Berlusconi faced no immediate charges related to Fadil's death. While her passing raised serious questions about witness protection and the lengths to which powerful individuals might go to protect themselves, there was no direct evidence linking Berlusconi or his associates to her poisoning. Italian prosecutors opened an investigation into her death, and while the possibility of foul play remained on the table, the investigation did not initially point to Berlusconi as a suspect. Still, the damage to Berlusconi's reputation was profound. Even though he was not legally implicated, the cloud of suspicion surrounding Fadil's death added another layer to the public's perception of him as a man who operated in a world where the rich and powerful could bend the rules to their advantage. The toxicology reports, the potential radioactive poisoning, and Fadil's role as a whistleblower all fed into the narrative that Berlusconi's empire was built not just on wealth, but on manipulation and suppression. In the months following Fadil's death, Berlusconi continued to maintain his innocence, but the trial itself was now irrevocably tainted. What might have been an opportunity to fully expose the truth about the Bunga Bunga parties and the exploitation that had taken place was overshadowed by the loss of a key witness and the lingering questions about how far those in power might go to protect their secrets. For Berlusconi, Fadil's death was a dark reminder of the heavy price that could be paid by those who stood in the way of the political and social elite. The autopsy of Imane Fadil, conducted following her death on March 15, 2019, was seen as a critical step in determining whether foul play had been involved. Given her role as a key witness in the high-profile trial of Silvio Berlusconi and her own fears that she had been poisoned, the results of the autopsy and accompanying toxicology reports were eagerly anticipated by both investigators and the public. However, the findings, while shedding light on certain aspects of her death, ultimately left many questions unresolved and gave rise to multiple theories about what had truly happened. Confirmed substances in the toxicology reports. The toxicology reports indicated that several heavy metals, including cadmium and antimony, were present in Imane Fadil's system. Both of these metals can be toxic in high concentrations, and their presence raised immediate red flags for investigators. Cadmium, commonly used in industrial processes, is highly toxic to humans and can cause damage to the kidneys, liver, and bones when ingested or inhaled in significant amounts. Antimony, often used in the production of flame retardants and batteries, can similarly be poisonous when absorbed into the body. In large doses, both substances can lead to organ failure, which matched the symptoms that Imane had exhibited in her final days. The presence of these metals supported the theory that Imane had been deliberately poisoned. Her symptoms, severe abdominal pain, vomiting, jaundice, a sign of liver failure, and ultimately multi-organ failure were consistent with heavy metal poisoning. Investigators initially believed that these substances could have been administered to her over a period of time, building up in her system until they reached fatal levels. Given her role as a whistleblower in the Berlusconi trial, it was plausible that someone with access to these toxic materials had used them to silence her. However, the toxicology reports did not detect the substances in concentrations typically associated with acute, immediate poisoning. Instead, the levels found in her body were concerning but not definitive enough to conclusively determine that the metals alone had caused her death. This led to speculation that the poisoning had either been administered gradually over time or that other factors, perhaps a combination of poisons, had contributed to her death. The presence of radioactive substances. Perhaps the most chilling finding from the toxicology reports was the detection of radioactive substances, though in low quantities. While not conclusive, traces of polonium 210, the same radioactive element that was used to poison former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko, were suspected to have been found. Polonium 210 is incredibly rare and highly lethal even in tiny doses, as it emits alpha radiation that destroys human tissue from within. The discovery of even small amounts of polonium immediately shifted the focus of the investigation toward the possibility of a sophisticated assassination. The mere presence of radioactive materials pointed to a calculated and deliberate poisoning, as these substances are not easily acquired. Polonium 210 is typically produced in nuclear reactors and has limited legitimate uses outside of specialized industrial or scientific settings. The theory that Imane had been poisoned with such a rare substance led investigators to consider whether her death had been the result of a targeted assassination, possibly orchestrated by individuals or entities with significant resources and access to radioactive materials. However, the levels of polonium detected in her system were not as high as in other documented cases of radioactive poisoning, such as Litvinenko's. This discrepancy led to several unresolved questions. Was the poisoning a failed attempt, or was the polonium administered in such small quantities to make the death appear more natural? Alternatively, could the polonium have been combined with other toxic substances, such as the heavy metals found in her system, to ensure a fatal outcome while avoiding immediate suspicion? Discrepancies and unresolved questions. Despite the confirmed presence of heavy metals and possible traces of polonium, the autopsy results left several critical questions unanswered. One of the most perplexing issues was the precise cause of death. While it was clear that Imane had suffered from multi-organ failure, the toxicology reports were not definitive enough to attribute her death solely to poisoning. The levels of heavy metals found in her body, while concerning, were not high enough on their own to explain her rapid decline, leaving open the possibility that another undetected poison or combination of poisons could have been involved. Another major discrepancy arose from the timing of her symptoms. Imane had been experiencing health problems for weeks before her hospitalization, leading some to believe that the poisoning had been administered gradually over time. However, her rapid deterioration in the hospital suggested that she had been exposed to a more significant dose of poison shortly before her admission. This raised the possibility that the poisoning had been a two-phase attack, an initial slow buildup of toxins followed by a lethal dose administered closer to the time of her death. There were also unresolved questions about how the poison had been delivered. Investigators speculated that it could have been ingested, perhaps through food or drink, or even absorbed through the skin via contaminated objects. However, no definitive evidence was found pointing to how or when the substances had entered her body. Given that Imane had been a public figure, attending events and interacting with numerous individuals in the weeks leading up to her death, the potential sources of poisoning were difficult to trace. Moreover, the forensic findings sparked debate among experts. Some toxicologists suggested that the levels of radioactive substances found in her system were not high enough to be lethal and questioned whether the polonium had played a significant role in her death. Others speculated that the combination of heavy metals and radioactive materials could have worked together to create a fatal reaction in her body, but this theory remains speculative without conclusive evidence. Emerging theories and speculation. The most prominent theory that emerged from the autopsy and toxicology reports was that Imane Fadil had been deliberately poisoned by individuals with access to both rare radioactive materials and more common toxic substances like heavy metals. This theory aligned with her own statements in the weeks before her death, where she repeatedly told friends and her lawyer that she believed she was being poisoned due to her involvement in the Berlusconi trial. However, the lack of clear, definitive evidence left room for other theories. Some investigators speculated that her death could have been the result of accidental exposure to toxins or even a combination of poisoning and an underlying medical condition. The presence of multiple toxins in her system, combined with a lack of a clear timeline for when she had been exposed, made it difficult to draw a firm conclusion. Despite the lingering questions, the autopsy results reinforced the growing belief that Imane's death was no accident. The discovery of heavy metals and possible radioactive substances pointed to foul play, and the circumstances surrounding her involvement in one of Italy's most high-profile trials only deepened the sense of conspiracy. Yet, without concrete answers, the full truth of what had happened to Imane Fadil remained elusive, leaving the door open for continued speculation and investigation. When Imane Fadil was first hospitalized on March 1, 2019, the Italian judicial system did not immediately grasp the severity of her condition. Despite her repeated claims that she believed she had been poisoned and her role as a key witness in the Berlusconi trial, the authorities failed to act swiftly. Instead of launching an immediate investigation into the potential criminal nature of her illness, the judiciary took a cautious approach, waiting until after her death to fully explore the possibility of foul play. This delay in action would later be widely criticized as crucial time and evidence were lost. Once Fadil passed away on March 15th, the Milan prosecutor's office formally opened an investigation into the circumstances of her death. The autopsy and toxicology tests revealed alarming details, traces of heavy metals, including cadmium and antimony, and possible radioactive substances. These findings pointed to poisoning, but by the time these results were available, weeks had already passed, leading to concerns that the investigation had not been treated with the urgency it required. The delay in performing these tests and the time it took to release the results only fueled speculation that the judiciary was reluctant to fully pursue the poisoning theory, possibly due to the political sensitivity of the case. The Italian judiciary faced growing criticism for its slow response. Many felt that the investigation into Fadil's death lacked the seriousness it deserved, given her pivotal role in the Berlusconi trial. Media outlets, both in Italy and internationally, highlighted the lack of urgency in gathering evidence, such as interviewing those who had been in contact with her or securing potential sources of poisoning. These delays, combined with the inconclusive nature of the toxicology reports, led to suspicions that the judiciary was hesitant to act decisively, particularly given the political stakes. Further compounding the criticism was the failure to protect Fadil as a key witness. She had expressed fears for her safety on multiple occasions, confiding in friends, doctors, and her lawyer that she believed she was being followed and that her life was in danger. Despite these warnings, no formal protection measures were put in place for her, raising serious questions about how the Italian judicial system handles the protection of witnesses involved in high stakes cases against powerful figures. Public frustration with the judiciary's handling of Fadil's death quickly mounted. Demonstrations took place outside the courthouse, with activists demanding greater transparency and accountability in the investigation. The delays and apparent reluctance of law enforcement and the courts to take swift action were seen as indicative of a broader issue within the Italian legal system. A system that, critics argued, is often slow to deliver justice, especially when dealing with politically connected individuals. The toxicology reports, which pointed to the presence of toxic metals and radioactive substances, became a focal point of the investigation. However, the levels detected were not high enough to conclusively establish the cause of death, leaving many unanswered questions. Some experts argued that more specialized toxicology teams should have been brought in earlier, given the complexity of the substances involved. Others raised concerns about whether key pieces of evidence had been lost or mishandled in the early stages of the investigation, further complicating efforts to uncover the truth. The political backdrop of the Berlusconi trial only intensified public suspicion. Berlusconi's enduring influence in Italian politics and his long history of legal battles led to widespread speculation that Fadil's death was being handled with a degree of caution to avoid upsetting the political balance. Berlusconi himself denied any involvement in her death, calling the accusations baseless and suggesting that her passing was being used as a tool to further tarnish his reputation. However, for many Italians, the judiciary's slow and cautious approach only reinforced the perception that the powerful could evade accountability. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the Italian judicial system had not only failed to act quickly, but had also missed opportunities to protect a crucial witness in a major trial. This failure, combined with the delays in forensic testing and the political sensitivities surrounding the case, led to widespread criticism of the judiciary's ability to handle cases involving powerful individuals. Imane Fadil's death became a symbol of the systemic issues plaguing Italy's legal system, from the inefficiencies in handling high profile investigations to the lack of adequate witness protection. Despite the public outcry and media attention, the case remained unresolved, with many questions still unanswered about how and why Fadil died, and whether justice would ever be served in a system that seemed incapable of holding the powerful accountable. In the aftermath of Imane Fadil's mysterious death, a plethora of conspiracy theories emerged, each attempting to make sense of the shocking circumstances surrounding her demise. Given her role as a witness in a scandal involving a powerful political figure like Silvio Berlusconi, it was almost inevitable that speculation would run rampant. While some theories found their roots in legitimate concerns about foul play, others veered into the realm of the outlandish, blurring the lines between fact and fiction. Theories rooted in political intrigue. One of the most prevalent theories suggested that Fadil's death was orchestrated by individuals within Berlusconi's inner circle who sought to silence her before she could provide further damaging testimony. This theory gained traction due to the toxicology findings, particularly the presence of heavy metals and radioactive substances, which many believed indicated a calculated assassination attempt. Given the high stakes involved in the trial, where Fadil's testimony could significantly impact Berlusconi's political future, this theory seemed plausible to many. Moreover, speculation arose about possible connections to organized crime given Berlusconi's historical ties to various underworld figures. Some theorized that criminal elements within his network were incentivized to eliminate a witness who could expose their activities. These theories, while grounded in established facts about Fadil's connections, often lacked concrete evidence and relied heavily on circumstantial details. Outlandish conspiracies. On the flip side, several conspiracy theories entered the realm of the absurd. Some claimed that Fadl had uncovered a vast international conspiracy involving spies, government agencies, and even foreign powers, all conspiring to manipulate political outcomes in Italy. These theories often referenced vague connections and shadowy figures without substantial evidence. For example, the idea that Fadl had been targeted by a foreign intelligence agency because of her connections to Berlusconi fell flat when scrutinized against the available facts. Additionally, there were fringe theories suggesting that Fadl had staged her death to escape the pressures of her situation or that she was being protected by secret organizations. These narratives, lacking any credible support, overshadowed more rational discussions about the very real political implications of her testimony and the legitimate concerns surrounding her death. When comparing these theories, it becomes evident that while some were grounded in the complexities of political intrigue, others were merely sensationalist. The established facts of the case, Fadl's role in the Berlusconi trial, her reported fears of being poisoned, and the troubling findings from the autopsy provide a solid foundation for questioning the circumstances of her death. However, as with many conspiracy theories, the absence of definitive evidence often leads to speculation that can overshadow the real issues at hand. Ultimately, the more plausible theories center on the political ramifications of her testimony, while the more outlandish ones distract from the urgent need for accountability in the face of potential wrongdoing. Fadl's family and friends were devastated by her untimely death, grappling with not only the loss of a beloved daughter and friend, but also the shocking circumstances surrounding it. In interviews, her family expressed deep anguish and disbelief, describing Imane as vibrant and full of dreams, whose life was cut short in a cruel twist of fate. They were vocal about their suspicions regarding her death, emphasizing their belief that it was not merely a tragic accident but a calculated act of violence aimed at silencing her. In the face of this pain, they rallied together, determined to seek justice for Imane, calling for a thorough investigation that would uncover the truth behind her demise. The case also cast a shadow over Moroccan Italian relations, as Fadil was a Moroccan national whose death occurred amidst an international scandal involving a prominent Italian figure. The Moroccan government expressed concern over the handling of the case, advocating for a comprehensive investigation. Diplomatic channels were opened as officials sought to ensure that Fadil's rights as a citizen were respected, highlighting the complexities that arose from her tragic situation. Discussions about justice for Fadil brought attention to issues of safety and support for individuals involved in high profile cases, especially those from marginalized backgrounds. In Italy, Fadil's case added fuel to an already turbulent political climate, intensifying public scrutiny of Berlusconi and his inner circle. Many Italians viewed her death as emblematic of a deeper issue: the pervasive corruption and impunity that plagued the political system. Public opinion began to shift against Berlusconi, with protests and demands for accountability growing louder. This case arguably served as a catalyst for discussions around political reform, prompting calls for greater transparency and protection for witnesses. The media played a significant role in shaping public perception of Fadl's case, often jumping to conclusions based on speculative theories. The sensational nature of the coverage sometimes overshadowed the facts, creating a narrative that heightened public outrage. As media outlets focused on the potential for political assassination, the slow pace of the investigation became a point of contention, leading to frustration among the public who demanded justice. As of now, the investigation into Fadl's death remains open, but progress has been sluggish. Various reports have indicated that while some evidence has been gathered, many questions remain unanswered. The political ramifications continue to ripple through Italian society, with calls for accountability still echoing. The case has not only left a mark on Fadl's family, but also on the larger conversation surrounding power and justice in Italy. In conclusion, Imane Fadil's legacy endures, symbolizing the fight for truth in the face of power. Her story continues to resonate within discussions about corruption, political accountability, and the protection of witnesses. The unanswered questions surrounding her death serve as a haunting reminder of the challenges that persist in the pursuit of justice. As we wrap up this exploration of Imane Fadil's tragic story, we invite you to reflect on the profound questions it raises about power, corruption, and the quest for justice. If you found this investigation compelling, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more in depth true crime stories. Join the conversation in the comments below. What do you think happened to Imane? Your voice matters, and together we can keep the conversation alive. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for our next episode.